All right, in this problem, we're given some information about 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and 14-year-olds and the cavities that they've had. So it says in this research that it was determined that 44% of 12-year-olds have never had a cavity, 35% of 13-year-olds have never had a cavity, and 25% of 14-year-olds have never had a cavity. If a child is selected at random from a group of 20 junior high students comprising so we have four 12-year-olds, six 13-year-olds, and we have 10 14-year-olds. And this child has never had a cavity. What is the probability that this child is 14 years old? Okay, so we want to calculate the probability of being a 14-year-old given that they've never had a cavity. Okay, so I'm going to call this not cavity. Never had a cavity. All right. So that's what we're trying to calculate. But we've got, okay, so we're going to break this down into a finite stochastic process. All right. We're just going to look at for the chance events, right? So we chose a child at random, and that child could have been 12 years old, could have been 13 years old, or they could have been 14 years old. Okay, so that's sort of our first element of chance, right? That's our first stochastic event, is that we're choosing a student, and there's so we have four, we have 4, 6, and 10. So that's a total of 20 students, right? And so there's a 4 out of 20 chance that that student is 12 years old. Okay, we have 6 13-year-olds, so that's 6 out of 20 chance that we chose a 13-year-old, and then there's a 10 out of 20 chance, or 1/2 chance that we chose a 14-year-old. Okay, so I'm just going to put those probabilities on there. And then, based on this information from the National Institute of Dental Research, we know the rate of cavities in these different age groups. Okay, so this child has some chance of having had a cavity or not having had a cavity, right? Same way with a 13-year-old. And the probabilities depend on on the age group that this child is in, right? So let's put this information on there. So it says that 44% of 12-year-olds have not had a cavity. Okay, so I'm going to call this C complement as not having a cavity. So I'm going to say this is 0.44, okay, which makes this 0.56, right, because they have to add up to 1. For 13-year-olds, it says that 35% of 13-year-olds have never had a cavity. Okay, so the probability of not having a cavity if you're 13 years old is 35%. So given that you're 13 years old, you'd have a 35% chance of never having had a cavity if you choose a 13-year-old at random. So which means that 65% have had a cavity. And then we're told that 25% of 14-year-olds have never had a cavity. So 25% chance, 0.25 chance that they've not had a cavity, which means there's a 75% chance that they have had a cavity. All right, now what we need the probability of being 14 years old and having a cavity, choosing a 14-year-old that has had a cavity, right? So over the probability of never having had a cavity in general. So we're looking for the cases where the student has not had a cavity. So I'm just going to circle these outcomes in which the child does not have a cavity, right? Because that's what we're told, that this child has never had a cavity, right? So we're just interested in those outcomes. All right, so what's the probability of being 12 years old, of choosing a 12-year-old that has not had a cavity, right? 12 years old and not had a cavity. Well, we're just going to multiply those probabilities. right? So we're going to take 4 over 20 times the 44%. Oops, sorry, just up 0.44. Okay. When I multiply that out, I got 0.088. What's the probability of choosing a 13-year-old who hasn't have a cavity? All right. Well, that's 6 out of 20 times the 0.35, which I got 0.105. And what's the probability of choosing a 14-year-old who has not had a cavity? Okay, well, there's a 10 out of 20 chance. Oops, sorry, 20. Oops, okay, 20. 10 out of 20 chance that we choose a 14-year-old, and then 25% of them have never had a cavity. So that gives us 0.125. Okay, so the probability, if I add up these probabilities, right, those are all the different ways that we could choose a child who has never had a cavity. So the probability of choosing a child that has never had a cavity is just going to be the sum of all of those. And so we get 0.318. Okay. All right, so we want to find the probability of that the child is 14 years old, given that they have never had a cavity. Okay, so we chose a child. Turns out they don't have never had a cavity. What's the probability that they're 14 years old? Right, 14 years old given never had a cavity. All right, so we're just going to take the probability of being 14 years old and never having had a cavity. Okay, so that would be 0.125. We're just going to get that from what we just calculated, and then we're going to divide by the probability of choosing a child that has never had a cavity. So that's going to be 0.318. Okay, and so if I put that in my calculator, I get 0.3931. Okay, so the probability, of that the child is 14 years old, given that he's never had a cavity, he or she has never had a cavity, is about 39%. All right, so I'll meet you for the next example.